Trail of Cthulhu, Knight's Black Agents, The Fall of Delta Green, Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition are only some of the titles that my guest today has designed.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Oh, guys, I am so excited today. My guest is a well-known RPG game designer and writer who has worked on numerous titles over his career. It was just an absolute pleasure to be able to interview him on the show today. So I am not going to waste any more time. Here's the interview. My guest today is the designer behind Trail of Cthulhu, Knight's Black Agents, The Fall of Delta Green, as well as the lead designer on Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition. He is also the co-host of Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, the Emmy award-winning podcast, Ken, Hite. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
How were you introduced to role-playing games?
I mean, I was introduced to role-playing games by the remarkably efficient method of being 11 when Advanced Dungeons & Dragons came out. The Monster Manual dropped. I was 11. I turned 12, basically, while I was making up monsters for it. It was 1977. Everyone was excited. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was just a cool book of monsters. I had no idea what the numbers did. And then when I got to school that fall, everyone sort of knew what was going on. And we had like a blue book, Holmes Blue Book, and we had one or two other pieces of D&D that had been scattered over the landscape in the last 3 years. So we sort of assembled an ad hoc blue book, but with Monster Manual monsters, sort of a game. And then the player's handbook hit, and then the DMG hit, and then it was, you know, I was there for life. It was the greatest thing in the world, and it's still the greatest thing in the world, and I'm not even close to 11 now. So good for me, right?
So what other games did you play besides Dungeons & Dragons?
I mean, it was a lot D&D at the very beginning. My church youth pastor perhaps had heard some rumor somewhere that D&D might be spiritually bad for you, so we played Traveler at church.
Okay.
Because that was capitalism, and that's what God ordains. And then, of course, Call of Cthulhu comes out in 1981, and my whole heart and soul turned to it forever. I played a bunch of stuff. We played the Gang Wars one was that took place in Lake City. There was the TSR Gangster one. We played a little bit of Boot Hill. We played a ton of Top Secret. We played a lot of stuff. But once Call of Cthulhu hit, it was Call of Cthulhu and the rest in a pack behind.
What was the appeal of Call of Cthulhu to you?
I mean, part of it was just that I'd read Lovecraft at the same basic impressionable age as I discovered role-playing. And to discover that there was a Lovecraft role-playing game was the greatest thing that could possibly ever happen. It doesn't hurt that it's also the greatest role-playing game that ever happened. Sandy's design miraculously combines mechanics and effect and theme and flavor in a way that very few games ever have and that none have done better. And it was followed up by a bunch of just absolute power hitter A-list adventures. So it was just a great experience at the time to be running Call of Cthulhu stuff as it came out. You know, every new adventure, you know, we'd get the gang together and assemble the team, and they'd run through it and die or get injured or go mad or whatever. And it was a terrific experience. It was just amazing. And this was the time when Lovecraft was beginning to sort of bubble up into the farthest reaches of the nerdosphere. So we would go driving around on the weekends. We would go to the comic book store, the game store, and the used bookstores and hunt for Cthulhu Mythos books and Lovecraft books that people had, you know, turned in over the decades previously. And so we assembled big pieces of the Ballantine Adult Fantasy Library that at that point was maybe 12, maybe a dozen years old. So people had bought it and gone to college and gotten rid of it. So there was sort of a stratum of Lovecraftian fiction in the used bookstores, but it was a job. It was a hunt. It was an investigation. So that, I think, fed our nerd acquisition powers. And so in the middle of getting comics and games, we were also dredging up Lost Lovecraft stuff, mostly so that I could spring things on the players that they hadn't already read. And the players, of course, were doing it so they could read things in case I sprang it on them. So it was an obsession that built on itself very admirably.
Obviously, you're a game designer now, but I doubt that was originally your plan when you started thinking about careers.
There are days when I wake up and it is not my plan now, but I am now unsuited for any other work. I would have to tell people I've been in prison if I tried to get a straight job. I sort of fell into it. I was working. I got out of college in the Bush Senior Recession, not to be confused with the Bush Junior Recession, and rather out of grad school in the Bush Senior Recession. And I was sort of temping and looking for a job with an international bank as an analyst. I thought that would be something I could do. And the international banks were being very, frankly, miserly. I don't like to say that about a bank, but that's just my impression at the time. So it was sort of back and forth, this and that. I had some buddies that I'd gone to grad school with who were fellow history nerds. And so we wrote, we were making up alternate histories anyway. And when Steve Jackson Games announced that they were looking for alternate histories for GURPS Time Travel, we thought, well, why don't we just write up some alternate histories? That could be fun. So we wrote up a few and sent them into Steve. And then I would go up to Gen Con on the train from Chicago because it was $20, and Chaosium would then house, and not particularly well, but they would feed me. So my only expenses were that train ticket and booze, basically. So Gen Con was cheap and beautiful. But I would go up there and I had a Chaosium badge, so Steve couldn't, ditch me. And I would say, hey, Steve, what about our proposal? Hey, Steve, what about our proposal? Hey, Steve, what about our proposal? And to his credit, he did eventually look at our proposal and said, well, this was very, very good. I probably should have hired you when it did come in. So he contracted me to write with my two partners, Mike Schiffer and Craig Newmeyer, GURPS Alternate Earths. And roughly at exactly the same time as that, one of my old Call of Cthulhu campaign buddies had gotten a job at Iron Crown Enterprises, and he had come across, thanks to that job, the playtest document for Nephilim from Chaosium, the English language version of the French game. And he was like, I wonder who do I know that would make sense of this melange of black magic and crazy history and occultism and secret societies. Oh, Ken, of course. So he sends that to me, and I emailed Chaosium like 11,000 words of back talk and commentary, and then I got an email from Greg Stafford, which means from heaven, from the God's realm, asking me, we're going to use this in the core book. Here's what we're going to pay you for that. What's the next book you want to write for us? And I said, well, if Greg Stafford tells you you're writing a book, you don't have an option. So I said, I'll write the Secret Societies book. So I had two book contracts, basically not quite within a month of each other, but it felt like it was within a month of each other at the time. And once you've done one, people will offer you more. I did an okay job, I think, with those books. And then it became apparent to my wife that I was enjoying writing role-playing games much more than I was working at an insurance company, which is what I was doing until the world's international banks figured things out. And so we decided that she would rather have a poor but happy husband than an angry but middle-class husband. And so we picked game writing, and one or two periods when the lights didn't quite stay on, notwithstanding, we've sort of never looked back. So that's what it took, is a couple of lucky strikes and a wife who is not very good at cost-benefit analysis.
Now, you worked on 2 Star Trek games, is that correct?
I did. I worked on the Last Unicorn Star Trek game, and then immediately following that, the Decipher Star Trek game. That was because the Star Trek license did not follow Last Unicorn to Wizards of the Coast, which Wizards of the Coast, I think, thought it would when they bought us. Instead, it was freed up, and Decipher snaffled it. And then Decipher, having a Star Trek license and no role-playing design team, said, gosh, I wonder where there's a Star Trek role-playing design team. And so we, having discovered that Wizards was not going to let us stay in our far-flung mutual lands and was going to make us all move to Seattle, we said, why don't we just jump ship and do it again for Decipher? So we did. And it was a great, first of all, everyone I worked with was terrific. It was a murderer's row: Steve Long, Ross Isaacs, Christian Moore, Owen Seiler, Matt Colville. These were some amazing people that I got to build games with, to begin with, George Vasilakos. And then also, when you design the same game twice for two different rule sets, I think it's really a good way to learn how game design works and what those numbers actually do in play. And yeah, I mean, you can run something by once, and if you don't ever have to go back and stress test your own design, you don't. But we sort of did, because we couldn't use all of our old solutions. We had to come up with a second solution for every problem we'd already solved. So I think that while I don't necessarily recommend it as an intellectually stimulating life, will definitely, work out your game design muscles.
I assume you were a Star Trek fan before you worked on those games. What does that feel like? What does that feel like to be a fan of a property and then get to work on it?
I mean, it's one of the greatest things in the world, and it's a shame that it is, because it's why a lot of game companies with beloved properties can get away with paying nothing or very little. But
because everybody is like, yeah, right, I'll work on it.
Right. When you get to type the word Captain Kirk or Romulans and it means something instead of just your fan fiction, which we barely had at the time. But anyway, that's big. That's important. And the fact that little bits of what we wrote made it onto the screen on Enterprise, that was a big moment for a lot of the people that wrote that source book, or those two source books that made it on. And I'm not gonna lie, it feels neat to be part of that universe, even at a remove or at a licensee distance. It's not the same as just making a towel. It's, I'm deciding what happened on Cestus 3 after the Gorns left it to the Federation. I'm deciding, what this ship looks like. Who are these bad guys? What's the story with the Tholians? All those sorts of big canon questions that you've asked, you can answer. And sometimes it'll stick around through the next iteration. But at the very least, while people are playing your game, Paramount is not going to come along and mock you. So,
what did Star Trek Enterprise take from the game?
There's a little bits of stuff about the Andorians, that they live on an ice planet. That was us. Oh, okay. And some individual words of Klingon and words of Andorian came from us.
Wow.
So we contributed little tiny bits to the Star Trek universe.
Well, that's incredible. Yeah, I for just like a quirk of fate, I never played those games, but I played FASA Star Trek.
Yeah, we used FASA as a model and a guiding post when we made our games. FASA Star Trek was great.
Yeah, I played the heck out of that thing. I would still do it if I could get my gaming group to agree to another campaign, but we'll see about that. But
it's 3 Star Treks old by now, so
yes, it is. I know, but I have the books, so
right.
I mean, it still works. A number of the people who listen to this show would be interested in game design, be interested in perhaps working in the industry. Now, I self-publish all my stuff, so I basically know nothing about the tabletop role-playing game industry. If somebody wants to work in the industry, what would you tell them?
Make sure your wife has health insurance. That's the first thing I would tell them. The second thing I would tell them is, or significant other, obviously, yes. Whoever. It's not just doughy guys like me anymore, thank God. But I would say that this is a different world than it was in the late 90s. That self-publishing is actually the road to success. That you can make a game or make a component for a game that has a community content program or an open system. And if you bang it together with all the inspiration that you have, you either learn how to do layout or you sweat equity a layout person, get some nice art. There's tons of it available in public domain. You can also, bring on an artist or have the layout person do your art for you as well as part of their half of the game product. You put that up and you are me. You are the same as me. You put that up on DM's Guild or Drive-Thru or Itch. Now you're a game designer and I'm a game designer. You and I are peers and colleagues. And the people, if your dream is to work for another game company and do freelance work for them, having that material as your demo reel is going to be much more impressive than just hanging out on the forums and sniping at the creators, which is how I think a lot of people believe that they will get noticed. Certainly there are companies that you will make more with your self-published stuff, if it's any good, than you will by working for them. So research pay rates, research what you can afford to spend on your hobby job. If you are extraordinarily thick-headed, you may wind up doing it full-time. It is possible, though not super easy, to make a living at it full-time. David Pulver used to say there are more astronauts than there are game designers. And there are more full-time Chinese astronauts than there are full-time role-playing game designers. So I think the Chinese space program has actually gotten a boost since Dave said that. So maybe we have to change it to India or somewhere. But it's not an easy field to get into and stay in, but it's an easy field to contribute to and be part of. Is I guess what I'm saying. That if you can afford, can make something that's good that will sell enough copies that you can afford to buy everything that you want for your hobby. I mean, tell me how someone does that if their hobby is skiing. They can't do it.
I think that is something that people miss, is that in this day and age with self-publishing, if you publish something, it can just act as your resume. And
it can act as your career. I mean, look at Kevin Crawford. All of his stuff is self-published. All of it is really good. And he just bangs it out with Kickstarter and other crowdfunding models. Yep. You don't even need Steve Jackson to finally read your manuscript. You can bang out your own manuscript and let everybody read it. You have to, of course, have some kind of a presence that makes people pay attention through the sea of crowdfunding. And that means, you have to be active on social media. You have to be in the universe of people that you want to buy your game, wherever that universe is. And if you're making a game that is entirely for bass fishermen, you have to be out there on bassfisher.net or whatever it is. But you have to be present in the world. You can't just throw it up and hope that great success finds you. But eventually, you put out 2, 3, 4 self-published games, people who do care about those things will find you, and then you will build an audience.
And actually, I've gone full-time as well, self-publishing. And,
see? There you go.
And I'm learning that point about like the health insurance point kind of painfully because I am actively on the marketplace now, which is consuming my time since it's the open enrollment period. So I'm trying to figure out that. But and
it is the LARP no one wanted to play.
Yes, because and it certainly feels like you entered a different world, certainly. And I think that, what you were just saying there is key. I mean, really, if you're doing all the rules and doing all the writing, and if you can get artwork either through public domain sources or something like that, you can publish a book for no cost.
I mean, assuming your time is not a cost.
Yes. Obviously. Well, of course, your time. But I mean, just thinking.
No outlay.
Yes. If people are thinking, oh, well, it'll probably cost $10,000 to publish this book. Well, no, not at all.
Yeah. Only if you go the old fashioned way and do an offset print run and put it all in your garage.
Yes.
Which I don't recommend.
No, I don't either. Print on demand is revolutionary. And
absolutely.
But I think your point too is that I try to tell people, because now I get a lot of questions too, and about self-publishing, and I try to let them know that writing, layout, publishing, that's 20%. You've done 20% of the work. 80% is marketing.
Yeah.
And I just try to let people know that. And of course, nobody wants to hear that. I didn't want to hear it. Nobody wants to hear that. But
everybody wants to release their genius of the world and wake up famous overnight like Guido Maupassant did. Well, go back to 1883 and try that, because it doesn't work now.
Yeah. And so, because there's just so much stuff out there now. Yeah, you have to just get in front of people. I mean, just looking at Drive-Thru RPG, if you look at Drive-Thru RPG in the morning and then at night, you can see at least 10 to 15 new free products have been published during the day. And it's just unbelievable. And
Drive-Thru has tools. I mean, they'll work with publishers, even new single alone publishers, to do everything that they can, because obviously they make money if you make money. Mm-hmm. So don't neglect those tools. Talk to whoever your rep is, or follow up on the little email or whatever. If you do that, you're already doing more than 80% of the other people are doing. So any amount of work you're doing is work that is separating you from the crowd and moving you out. And obviously I recommend doing a chunk of that work in the original creation, but certainly as you go through the process, you have to keep doing it.
Yeah, Drive-Thru has tools that you can use and ways you can contact your customers and things, and you have to take advantage of those, or you're finished. I just think it is amazing. Like I was saying earlier, that I don't really know anything about the role-playing game industry, but I'm a full-time role-playing game designer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kind of blows my mind. Right. And I'm just starting to kind of get out there and get to know people a little bit.
And so much of what I could tell you about the industry is out of date. It's old. It's vital information if you wanted to go back and pester Chaosium for work in 1998. It's not necessarily valuable for pestering Chaosium for work now. It's a different skill set than it was then. And, part of the, good and the bad of having a 20-year career or whatever it is for me is that I don't have to do as much pestering, but also there are new magical things out there all the time that I'm barely aware of. And that's another reason to pay attention to younger designers. Not only are they going to be smart and clever and interesting and revolutionary, they also they know how to turn a nickel out of whatever it is they're doing, and you don't know that necessarily. So everyone should always be meeting other designers and talking shop and trading notes and doing everything you can to be a community of designers, not just some lone gothic creator in their garret or on a crag. That is a great way to starve to death, as it even was back then.
But I do just still hear a lot of people who, I tell them about self-publishing and they're always usually I'll get a response like something, yeah, but I want to submit it to a company. I want to submit my idea to a company. And I just try to kind of let people know, I think that's a bit outdated.
Yeah. I mean, every now and again, you'll hear about a given company that's doing an open call for manuscripts or something, but it doesn't seem to happen a lot. And even when it did happen, you were competing with everyone else like you. It's a better place to be everyone else like you, except you've already self-published 6 or 7 source books or setting books or class books or whatever kind of a thing it is you want to do for the game system that you want to write for.
You have to do your own stuff and put it out nowadays. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that somewhere out there in the world, Chaosium has got a what we want to see a page of submission guidelines, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Other companies that depend on that kind of creation, maybe. But right now, if WotC wants something, they'll reach down to the people that are already self-publishing. Yep. They'll go to the guys on the DMs Guild and women on the DMs Guild and say, that was very good. How would you like to go up to the next level? Mm-hmm. And that's where James Intercasso came from. That's where Hannah Rose came from. A lot of those people that are now doing the thing where they write for a company, they did it for self-published on the community content or elsewhere on the internet.
I guess it was fairly recent. One of your games. Could you tell us a little about Fall of Delta Green?
Fall of Delta Green was a weird byproduct of the Delta Green role-playing game Kickstarter. When Arc Dream decided to go standalone with Delta Green, no longer make it a Call of Cthulhu setting, but make it its own game. They got Greg Stolze and Shane Ivey went in and made the rules even darker than they were. And I was brought in to write some of the unnatural and the secret histories and stuff like that. And at the time they thought, what's the other big place that Cthulhu gamers gather? It's in the Gumshoe Trail of Cthulhu Pelgrane universe. So they thought it would be fun to have a Gumshoe version of Delta Green, but it wouldn't just be the Gumshoe version of Delta Green in the modern day, because that would split the audience. No one would buy both, right? You would either buy Gumshoe or you would buy the Arc Dream, and they didn't want that. And no one wanted that. We didn't want that. So they said, how about we do a historical era of Delta Green, and then that becomes the little empire of Gumshoe, and people can use that to play their own Gumshoe Delta Green in any era, but the game will be about something else, so that even people who are playing the modern game will still look back to it for source material. And they offered me the 1950s, and I counter-offered with the 1960s, which, because it has a natural end at the point where Delta Green is dissolved, it felt kind of more like a coherent setting to use. You start, at the tail end of the Eisenhower administration. I figure 5 guys and a case of rifles will solve this Indochina problem, and then you end in 1970 with Cambodia, and that's a good arc for the agency. It's a good arc for the characters. It's a good arc for the game world. Mm-hmm. So what wound up being is a standalone Gumshoe iteration of the Delta Green role-playing game set in the 1960s, and all of those had to go into the book, which means the book is thick and perhaps doesn't have as much wild history and other things as a book that I normally do, but I did try to jam it into the corners everywhere I possibly could. And on the Pelgrane website, I've been writing endless amounts of other things to drop in. So it's sort of an ongoing process for me. And then we're just now finishing, in the sense that Gareth Hanrahan, my beautiful rival, Racer X, is completing the editing of our massive globe-trotting campaign for Fall of Delta Green, the Borellis Connection, which takes place in and around the heroin trade at the end of the 1960s and is a ginormous piece of work. I sort of sketched out the outline, and then I wrote the big scenario that takes place in Saigon, and Gareth basically did all of the other heavy lifting, I think. And it's certainly doing even more by trying to get that manuscript down to a publishable length, which we discovered too late in the process we had done badly.
I'm still learning about Delta Green because I had not kind of in that area, so I'm still learning about that. So that's just really fantastic. I guess just like a basic design question. I think a lot of people have ideas. I still have a ton of ideas. How do you know when an idea actually works for either a game or a campaign or something? Like, I mean, I'm sure there are tons of ideas that just don't work.
Right.
Like, how do you know the difference?
Well, I mean, with some things, it's like, Michelangelo looks at that block of marble and it's an elephant. You've just done it long enough. Some of it is, I think the idea has to be able to be hooky and sticky and bring in a lot of different game groups. So if you think of the idea and you think of one great thing that can be done with it, congratulations, you've written a movie. If you think of an idea and think of 25 things that can be done with it, congratulations, you've written a TV show. If you come up with a great idea and you can't stop thinking of the good things that could be done with it from all kind of different directions, now you're beginning to make a role-playing game. That's an idea that actually has some legs. If you have the time and the possibility, play test it with your own game group, run people through it. It may turn out that the idea seemed great at the beginning, but it narrows down rapidly and all the stories end the same way. Maybe you can turn that into a virtue, maybe not. And then, toss it out there, see what people think. Or, as I do, start with Earth, because by definition, everything on Earth has a million different stories happen in it, because that's how Earth works. So if you're setting a game in the American Civil War, guess what? Lots of stuff going on in the American Civil War. And even if your idea is the American Civil War but elves, you still got all those Civil War stories that you can use. So that, I think, is my cheat mode, is if I'm doing secret government program to fight the Cthulhu mythos in the 1960s, with the Vietnam War as a major centerpiece, well, that's 4 great ideas right there. One of those is going to be at the forefront in any game that you run. You
do seem to like a lot of real history in your games. What does real history add to a role-playing game that just a purely fantasy kind of setting doesn't?
Well, there's 2 things it adds over and above the fact that someone else has done all your maps for you, and they're great. It adds immediate engagement with the audience. So if I tell you, this is a game about Kragar the Liberator, but secretly he's an elf, you don't care. You've never heard of Kragar the Liberator, you don't care that he's an elf. If I tell you this is a game about Abraham Lincoln, but secretly he's an elf, now at the very least, you're very concerned that I get my medication. But I have buy-in now. You want to know, why do you think he was an elf? Just because he was tall and had a piping voice and could convince people to do things? That, all right, okay, I see it. He's an elf. And then what does that do? What's that happening in your story? That's a thing. You've got buy-in. People know what India is. People know what Vietnam is. People know what the CIA is. People know what all these cool story elements that we live in, immersed in, are. People don't necessarily know who your imaginary fantasy elf guy is. And yeah, eventually Elminster can maybe take on that weight, thanks to Ed Greenwood having hit very early in the hobby and Forgotten Realms filling an appetite for a hex crawl that was in existence at the time, and being genuinely engaging as a melange of fantasy in the D&D way. But if you are trying to do it, guess what? Ed has already beaten you there. He's got Forgotten Realms. People who want to read about a big fantasy kingdom of elves are really, they're choked for possibility. But there is literally nothing about, say, medieval India. There's no role-playing game about that. You can have your own magical kingdom full of elephants and sorcerers and wizards and creepy Europeans and all manner of things. And it's right there. And no one's done it. So why be the 95th person to come up with the orcs when you could be the first person to tell me about the Moguls, right? I mean, that's... Mm-hmm. And I can go on Wikipedia and look at the Moguls and be impressed by all that cool art and design and that very, very big empire. And that's a thing that I can care about. Whereas unless I really, really like you, or something about your game is already so hooky that I'm forced to pay attention to it, I will never care about your orcs. because I have Tolkien's orcs, and they're better orcs. I have other people have orked us out. We're done. We're full up. Now, again, the marketplace does occasionally reward fantasy worlds, and often that is because the art is terrific, like Asterin, or because the marketplace is just, we're in a new world the way that we were with Ed, where we have suddenly a whole new lobe of D&D players, and I think a lot of them are looking for their Forgotten Realms, or it's being presented very, very engagingly, like in Game of Thrones or like in Critical Role. And so you care about that because you learn to be interested in Matt Mercer or Daenerys. And so now you care about the world that they're in because you already cared about those people. But my argument is we already care about Queen Elizabeth and William Shakespeare. So we're already there. Look at that.
And I'm becoming more and more aware of kind of how to use history in games, probably each year that I play. And so that is interesting to hear your take on that, because I think it's absolutely true that there is so much depth in the real world that it's a shame to let some of that go to waste.
Yeah, I mean, you've got all this great stuff that no one is using, so try using it. I mean, don't do it in a cynical way. Mm-hmm. Don't say, "Oh, I think the Sioux Indians are cool, so I'm going to do a Sioux Indian game." I mean, you have to do the research. You have to go and learn about the Sioux and learn that you should probably call them Lakota if you're doing a game about them today, and learn, enough about that world so that it feels real, because that's the whole point of the game, is to produce verisimilitude. But, that's what research is for. And the great thing about the real world is you can do that research. Other underpaid creatives have already gone out and done that in the form of PhD programs. So you can harvest that and scythe off the 10% that's gameable and go nuts with it.
I mentioned in the intro that you were the lead designer on Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. I am a total vampire noob, so I don't know much about that. I was in the scene when it came out, but I was running a ton of Star Trek, West End Star Trek.
You're the guy running Star Trek at the vampire meeting.
Yeah, well, and then West End Star Wars and stuff like that. So I was running all of that during that time. So just really briefly, what is Vampire the Masquerade for those who might not be familiar? And then what does being a lead designer on 5th edition actually mean?
Vampire the Masquerade is a game that came out in 1991. It was designed by Mark Reinhagen and a number of other excellent writers and designers. And it posits a world in which, rather than play the good guys hunting down the vampires, you played the vampires, and you went through the sort of gothic struggle of being a monster, but trying to be at war with yourself against that. And the sort of grand addition to that is that you were also not just at war with yourself, you were at war with all the other vampires in the form of their vampire politics. So the vampires were preventing you from doing what you wanted to do as a vampire. And so you are trapped in a world of vampire politics, and just as you're trapped in your own vampirism. So it immediately blew up with sort of the theater crowd and the drama crowd in a way that the sort of chess club background of D&D had not. It was very, very easy to LARP, and was LARPed almost from the beginning, and rapidly attracted the difference between Gen Con in 1991 and Gen Con in 92 was that suddenly it was about 30% female attendees the next year, because that was all Vampire had driven that it was very open to women, to people of color, to non-binary, although we didn't know that word then, people all over the GLBTQ spectrum. It was hugely open to that, because Vampire is a story of outsiders who are being transgressed against, even as they're transgressing the old moral code. And so it was very appealing and very open, and the creators and designers very much worked to open it to that audience. So basically, it began as this sort of game of gothic role-playing informed by Anne Rice mostly, but other vampire stories as well. There's lots of different vampire clans. So your favorite vampire, whatever it is, shows up as one of the clans or one of the tribes. And then it sort of built onto itself this immense backstory, the world of darkness, and spawned sequel games and spin-off games. So you had a werewolf game, you had a mage game, you had a ghost game, you had a fairy game, Changeling, all of which happen in the same world of darkness. So the world of darkness being this enormous backstory, very complex, very iterative. The vampires themselves, through the editions, get more powerful. So rather than beginning as the kids, like you did in the first one, just newly created vampires, by third edition, you were becoming sort of middle management vampires. And And so the power creep happened. And then also because people did not want to play characters who suffered, they wanted to play characters who were awesome.
Yeah.
So it became a little bit of a power creep as well in that direction. And because that is one of the ways that you keep a game line going, is to offer better powers to people who buy the next supplement. You saw that as well. So it sort of became too big for any one person to enjoy as a whole, although obviously you could pick out your little bits. And it fell apart or was ended, depending on who you ask, by White Wolf with an apocalypse and then with a reboot into a new game system, Vampire the Requiem, which was not World of Darkness, and did its own thing. And that, of course, forked the audience as could have been predicted. And so the World of Darkness audience continued along with licensors, primarily Onyx Path now. At the time, it was various other people. And then in 16, I want to say, I got contacted by the current owners of the IP, which is the Swedish game company Paradox, which had within it a little imprint, White Wolf, designed basically to manage the intellectual property. And they said, we would like you to lead the team to design the new vampire game. And I said, are you sure you have the right person? My vampire game is about killing you. And they said, that's exactly why we want you to do this one, because this is going to be about vampires who are penned back in the cities by the resurgent forces of humanity. The Second Inquisition is on the march. The secret warriors are out killing vampires. Vampires themselves are back on their back foot. They've become more feral. Their politics have blown up. It's a different story. It's a more contemporary story. We think maybe you'd be a good guy for that. And they flew me out. They flew me out to Sweden, and we got along really great. And so, being lead designer basically was the matter of going back through the old storyteller system and taking out the things I didn't like, and putting in things that would feed, as it were, the story that we were telling, which was the story that was the story from 1991. You are in a political world that you didn't make, and that is dangerous. You are hunted from the outside. Back in the early days, it was by werewolves. Now it's by the NSA. You have a compulsion to feed that tears at you and destroys your humanity. We changed the blood system around to create that death spiral, the way that Sandy Peterson did back in the day with Sanity and Call of Cthulhu. We have hunger as a death spiral in the new vampire that was designed by a great designer named Kari Muammar. So if you're asking what is a lead designer's job, it is to recognize an amazing mechanic that does everything you want and get out of the way of it. And that's what I did. And Kareem and I built a humanity system. I think what happened there with that was he built one and I didn't like it, and I built one and he didn't like it. And then we took the sort of ruins of both of ours and built a third one, using some of the rules from Vampire the Requiem, which were actually very good rules for maintaining connection to human lives and human concerns, and put that in. And then I just made up systems for all the things Vampire had always said you could do, but never actually given you a mechanic for. So you are supposed to be immortal conspirators launching an immortal conspiracy. There's no rules for that. Well, now there is. It's a game about love and social positioning, which there are no rules for. Well, now there are. It's a game about being immortal and having things in your past reflect on your present. There were no rules for that. Now there are. So it's just a matter of going back into what 1991 Vampire said it was, making it a game that you could play in the modern era, stripping out the things that went against that feel, like botch dice. Every person who ran Vampire has a story about how botch dice made their Secret Master of the Night look like an Abbott and Costello character. That doesn't feed themes, so out they went. And then create the story that Vampire has always been about through all of those iterations, and then provide mechanics that reinforce it. That's what being a lead designer was, basically. And there was lots of other people on the team. There was Martin Ulrichsen, who was sort of the creative lead. There was a Swedish game theorist named Carl Bergstrom, I think it was, or Borgstrom. I'm going to get it wrong, but it's Carl. And he had a bunch of sort of very cold-blooded analysis of no one ever plays this mechanic. This mechanic is roundly rejected. So if we were going to keep something like that mechanic, and we had to sort of backstop it and give reasons for that to happen in play. So he had a very sort of a good overview look. And it was just about drawing from my own experiences with the game and everyone that I knew. I'd written for the game back in the day. So, and I could talk to people about what did they think and what was possible. But at the end of the day, we had basically a year to make a version of Vampire the Masquerade that felt like it was written this century, that was about the same concerns that the 1991 one said it was about, and that supported all of that through play. And that was a big enough job, I think, for anybody, really.
Well, you just mentioned, I think, just a title. You said creative lead. What's the difference between a creative lead and a lead game designer?
Well, every game company has its own rules for how these things parse out.
Sure.
But at White Wolf, the creative lead's job is to say, this is what Vampire is going to look like. It's going to have this feel. It's going to have this flavor. It's going to be about these things, not these other things. Here's the parts of the backstory that we're going to emphasize. Here's the parts of the backstory we're going to de-emphasize. And one of the things that happened when I came on the job, because of course I was also helping write the background, was, all right, the old World of Darkness had 1,000,000,000 billion NPC vampires. It was thick with them. And I said, give me a list of the ones I'm not allowed to kill in the text. And everyone else, I'm just going to kill. And so that's what the creative lead's job was to say, no, you can't kill that vampire. They're too popular. They sell too many computer games. There are too many shirts. Okay, but can we kill this vampire who's a jerk and I hate? Yes. So that's the creative's lead. And then the lead designer my job was to say, that mechanic is wrong. It's not going to feed theme. It's not going to work. That mechanic is amazing. This seems underpowered to me. And then it's a discussion. Neither of us are dictators. Martin, if I got a great idea, would say that's a great idea and put it into his image. I came up with the idea, for example, that we blew up the Tremere. The Tremere were these sort of wizard vampires, and they had their own chantry, their own sort of wizard headquarters in Vienna. And it made Tremere, when they played in the game, very bulletproof, because they were like, oh, well, I'm backed up by this incredible resource. And it was super annoying in LARPs, apparently, although I wasn't a big LARPer then or now. And so I said, well, the CIA likes blowing things up. This is a war on vampire terror. Let's make this the Osama raid of the war on vampires, that they actually find the Tremere Chantry and blow it up somehow. And that will mess the Tremere up well and good. And it will be a sign that, yes, real things that people care about in the game world are at risk. And I think I don't think that Eric was intending that to be the case, but Martin Erickson intended that to be the case, but he saw that it worked story-wise, and he said, yes, let's do it, and got very enthusiastic about it. So it was like that, and then they would come up with ideas for the rules or whatever, and things that they thought should be in it. So it's a give and take. It's a cooperative system, but at the end of the day, it's someone's job to say no or yes, and that's the lead person. But in a smaller house, the lead creative might also be the lead game designer.
Okay.
Or your lead creative might be at Paramount, and you have to listen to what they say, no matter how wrong-headed it is.
Maybe just quickly for somebody who doesn't know, what is Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff?
Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff is the podcast that I co-host with the beloved Robin D. Laws, immortal game designer, author of Robin's Laws of Good Gaming and Hamlet's Hit Points, and all manner of why it is that your games are fun and how they could be funner theory, and then a lot of excellent games that put the money where his mouth is. And we drop every Friday at KenandRobinTalkAboutStuff.com. We have a series of 15-minute segments on each show. Begins usually in the Gaming Hut, where we address some common piece of GMing or player advice or trouble. Then it moves into any one of a number of other topics. So we have a Cinema Hut. We have the Consulting Occultist, where the Consulting Occultist, which is me, lays down the 911 on whatever, or the 411 rather, sometimes the 911, on whatever weird occultist one of us has found in the research. Ken's Time Machine, where I go back in time and fix history or prevent it from being made worse with just my wits and a bottle of vodka. The Food Hut, where we talk about food. Tradecraft Hut, where we talk about news in the world of spies. So all of it with an eye towards gaming and an eye towards being entertainingly usable. And since it's 15-minute segments, no one gets super bored. And even if they are super bored, they can just fast forward, and there we are with another segment that may be more to their liking. And basically it gives me an excuse to talk to Robin every week, which is gold in itself. And then people seem to like it. And we have a Patreon that people can back if they are so minded. And that's nice, because it means I have grocery money, and I like to eat. My cat likes to eat. Everyone in my house likes to eat. So that helps.
Yeah. Well, I am a proud patron of Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff.
Thank you, Matt. You're a hero.
Well, I don't know about that, but yes, I am a proud.
I do. I said it.
All
it's
right.
Official.
Okay.
It's
official.
right here on the podcast.
Yeah.
It's on 2 podcasts.
Yeah, you guys have actually answered a couple of my questions, which
that's something that comes with your exalted Patreon backing status.
Yes, absolutely. So I would recommend to everybody to become a patron, so they can ask you guys questions, because some of the answers are great. I know a lot of my audience are game masters and they're running games. Do you still run a personal game?
Oh yeah, I'm right now running 2 games a week, which is maybe too many. But one game is my main game that has been running Monday nights ever since I moved to Chicago. So it's not always the same players, although I have one player in it who came back to Chicago from the Minnesota and California, and then back to Chicago and rejoined my game as though nothing had happened and all was forgiven. And that is right now a 13th Age game set in the Hellenistic era in the 3rd century BC. Players are 8th level, which is like 16th level in D&D, and they are deciding whether they're going to invade and overthrow the Maurya Empire in India. I'm sort of rooting for yes, but whatever they want is what I will make happen, because I'm a good GM. And then I'm running a game right now on Wednesdays, which I began for nascent game designers that I know in Hyde Park in my neighborhood in Chicago, and was sort of the secret goal of that was to get them all to think about Gumshoe as a game engine, and I'm running Fall of Delta Green for them. So that's sort of what's going on Wednesdays. And then it's slowly morphing into a more normal game group, which means I either have to think about, do I actually have enough gas in the tank to run 2 games a week, or just embrace it and say, many, many children are sent to bed with no games a week. So just suck it up, Ken.
Well, you're making me wish I lived in Chicago now. So.
Well, everyone should live in Chicago. It's the greatest city in the world, man. I thought you knew that.
Oh,
it seemed like you've done the reading.
I'm in St. Louis, so we do have a baseball problem with each other there in Chicago. Wow. So we do have a little bit of that. So, so I'm not too far away, but yeah. I'm fairly close. Now, one popular question that I like to ask: how do you prepare for a session? So many people just seem to be I think it's great because a lot more people are getting into the hobby kind of nowadays, thanks to Critical Role and some of these things. And people are asking questions about GMing. How do you prepare for a session?
It depends on the game. For something like 13th Age, it really is about just having the next combat statted up. And because the monsters in 13th Age are so compact, it's very, very easy to do that. The 13th Age D&D, what we call the F20 games on Ken and Robin, fantasy games that use a D24, they're basically, if you think of them as car chase movies or musicals in which the fight scene is the thing that propels story, you get an idea of what those games are about. So if you've got an idea of what the next fight is going to look like, the players can do whatever they want, including in some cases avoid the fight. Then you have to stand up the next one, which doesn't take that long. But prep is very low prep for me because I know the world. Again, it's the 3rd century. If they go in a direction that I didn't know, or they, for example, land in the middle of Arabia just because, they were out of food, and it's like, okay, what's the nearest dot on the map there? I look it up on Wikipedia. Oh, look, there's an old, possibly Assyrian temple there. And there was, look at that, human sacrifice was practiced at that temple. Guess I know what the story is. I mean, it's just that easy. It's literally falling off a log. That took me maybe 5 minutes on Google to find that story. So I was ready for the next game. You know what your players are. You trust them to drive story in interesting ways. It's an interactive art form for a reason. And then that's all you really need to do. With Fall of Delta Green, there's more details because it takes place in a more detailed era. It's an investigative game, so you have to be ready with answers for whatever the characters are thinking of doing. That generally requires at least a page of notes where this is the backstory and this is what's going on. And the characters will always add more to that because they will go off and ask other questions. But if you know your backstory well enough, you can figure out what would be the backstory in this alternate where this greengrocer is important. So how do you drag him into the backstory? How do you connect him to the backstory? Okay. And again, it's just a matter of knowing your world and knowing what's going on well enough, and how much prep that takes for you depends on every individual GM. So some GMs can walk in and wing it with an index card. Other GMs walk in with a notebook, and it's down to the individual GM and what they feel like they can handle in terms of load cognitively. If you feel like you are a person who needs a lot of information, I would suggest running Call of Cthulhu or Dungeons and Dragons, where there's a lot of really good pre-made adventures. And even I'm running pre-made adventures every now and again at 13th Age because I can get a dungeon from Pathfinder or whatever and just strip out all the Pathfinderiness and, oh, look, it's a room with monsters in it. Well, there we go. That's my fight scene. And it's super fun and super easy. And I mean, there's a reason the dungeon crawl is king, is because it's an amazingly efficient way to store information and an amazingly fun way to have a series of fights that feel like they mean something.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And of course, I just published a book a little bit ago called The No Prep Game Master. So I like allowing the dice to tell stories. So when my players ask me questions, I have some tips and tricks on how the game master can just roll dice and come up with answers to some of their questions and just kind of roll with it. But I do agree that the dungeon crawl is kind of often overlooked by certain groups, but it is amazing. And I think too that there are ways to take that dungeon crawl and put it into different games, like in a sci-fi game, because you can just have maybe like a facility or something like that.
Or an abandoned relic ship.
Yep. And you just run them. Yep, you just run them through it, and it's just basically you're running a ship or something, or an abandoned lab or a ghost ship as a dungeon. And, and players seem to like lose their minds and have a blast and don't realize that you just ran them through a dungeon.
I mean, it's like anything else, right? A solid diet of it becomes samey and stale. Mm-hmm. But I feel like, it's not candy corn. It's a steak. Don't eat a steak every day. It's probably you'll get rickets for one thing, but have steak more often. You don't even have to pay for it in a dungeon crawl. It's just magic.
All right, Ken, this has been great. Where can people find out more about you online?
They can find out about me by assiduously following all my social medias. I'm at Kenneth Hite on the Twitter. I'm Kenneth Hite on the Facebook. You can find me pretty easily. I'm even on Instagram, although sort of, not really. No one wants to see a 54-year-old game designer on Instagram, for God's sake. But there I am on the internet. You can also, of course, listen and ideally patronize Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, where Robin and I will share goodness and wisdom to you every week. So finding me is pretty simple. I'm a citizen of the web.
All right. And I will provide links to all of those things in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So, Ken, I could probably just continue to ask you questions all day, but I will stop. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, no problem. Let me just plug, since we are at the end of the show and the traditional plugging time.
Sure.
I'm right now writing Hellenistica, which is the D&D 5th edition version of my 13th Age home campaign set in the Hellenistic era, the good parts version, which is the era that is most like an actual D&D world, in that there are monsters over every hill. There are weirdos in the cities with resurrection magic. There are big bags of gold because Alexander the Great busted up the Persian treasury system and no one quite knows what to do with it yet. And wandering adventurers with swords can literally carve themselves a kingdom if they want to, because it absolutely happened in the real world. So that's what I'm doing now. Look for it to be kickstarting early next year, maybe first quarter of next year. And I hope that everyone pays attention and maybe gives it a thought when it does come out.
That sounds incredible. It's called Hellenistica?
Hellenistica with a K. It'll be with Handiwork Games. The John Hodgson, the amazing guy who art directed all of Cubicle 7 stuff forever, is founded his own game company. He'll be doing the art and the art direction. It's going to be an amazing looking book, and it's going to be full of weird Greek monsters and cults and sorceries and gods.
Well, just again, I'll provide links to that if they're available at the time, or information for people. So, Ken, just thank you for being on the show today.
No, happy to do it, man.
All right. Well, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed today's interview with Ken. As I mentioned, I have linked up some of Ken's RPGs as well as his podcast, Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. You definitely want to check those out. Now, if you want something for free, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps. Plus, you will never miss an episode of this show. Also, if you would like me to continue making episodes of this show, please head over to Patreon/dicegeeks and consider supporting the show. Every bit of support that I receive helps make this show better and better. Okay, well, I thank you for listening today, and until next time, keep gaming.